The function of depression, an evolutionary perspective. Here's a question to sit with as we begin. If depression is purely a malfunction, a glitch in the human machine with no adaptive value, why hasn't evolution eliminated it entirely? Why do millions of people across every known culture throughout recorded history experience depressive episodes? And perhaps most intriguingly, why do depression and genius, depression and creativity, depression and moral sensitivity so often appear together? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're questions that have puzzled psychiatrists, evolutionary biologists, psychologists, and philosophers for generations. And they point toward an uncomfortable but increasingly well-supported idea that depression isn't simply a disorder that we need to cure away, but rather a complex psychological mechanism that, in its proper context, served important functions for our ancestors and might still serve functions today, even as modern life has created conditions where depression becomes maladaptive. Brief overview of the topic. Over the next few hours, we're going to journey through several interconnected territories. We'll start by examining what depression actually is, moving beyond the clinical language and pharmaceutical categories to understand the actual subjective experience and neurobiological reality of depressive states. We'll then travel backward in time, exploring what we know about the evolutionary pressures that shaped the human mind, and asking how depression might have provided advantages to our ancestors. From there, we'll examine specific theories about depression's function, how it might have served as a signal, a reset mechanism, a form of social communication, a way of conserving energy during times of scarcity, or a system for promoting realistic thinking and careful analysis. We'll look at the evidence supporting these theories and the evidence that complicates them. We'll explore how depression relates to other psychological phenomena, sadness, grief, burnout, social subordination, and how understanding these relationships illuminates the nature of depression itself. We'll consider the difference between depression as it manifests in ancestral environments versus modern environments, recognizing that a mechanism can be evolutionarily adaptive in one context while being profoundly maladaptive in another. And finally, we'll explore what an evolutionary understanding of depression might mean for how we treat it, prevent it, and live with it. This is not a simple story. Depression is not a single thing with a single cause and a single function. It exists on a spectrum, takes multiple forms, and likely involves multiple systems and multiple evolutionary logics. But that complexity, while challenging, is also where the real insight lies. Understanding depression. When we talk about depression, we need to be careful about what we're actually discussing. In modern psychiatric terminology, depression encompasses a range of conditions, from major depressive disorder to persistent depressive disorder, dysthymia, to depression as a symptom in other conditions like bipolar disorder. But before we had diagnostic categories, before we had pharmaceuticals and brain imaging, depression was simply something humans experienced, a state of being that was as recognizable to Aristotle as it is to us today. The medieval term melancholia captures something that modern medical language sometimes misses. Melancholia wasn't just sadness, it was a complex state involving profound loss of motivation, changes in sleep and appetite, altered perception of time and meaning, physical heaviness, social withdrawal, and a particular quality of thought, a tendency toward rumination, toward seeing flaws and failures with devastating clarity, toward questioning meaning and purpose. Let's define depression operationally for our purposes. Depression is a psychological and physiological state characterized by several interconnected features. First, there's a profound reduction in motivation and initiative, what researchers call behavioral inhibition. The person experiencing depression finds it difficult to initiate action, to pursue goals, to engage in activities that previously held meaning or pleasure. This isn't mere laziness or choice. It's a state in which the brain's reward systems seem to have been downregulated, in which future possibilities lose their motivational force. Second, there are changes in cognitive processing. Depressed individuals tend to show what researchers call depressive realism, a tendency to perceive situations more accurately than non-depressed individuals, particularly regarding threats, failures, and the actual efficacy of their own actions. This sounds paradoxical, but the research is increasingly clear. Depressed people tend to be less prone to the positive illusions and self-serving biases that characterize normal cognition. They ruminate more, but often on genuine problems. Their pessimism, while painful, is often more calibrated to actual circumstances. Third, there are changes in social behavior and cognition. Depression typically involves social withdrawal, reduced interest in social engagement, and a shift in social attention toward threat, rejection, and status hierarchies. The depressed person becomes hyper-aware of their social standing, acutely sensitive to rejection, and often preoccupied with their own failings and inadequacies in social contexts. Fourth, there are physiological changes, altered sleep architecture, typically with early morning awakening and increased REM sleep, changes in appetite and energy levels, and alterations in the functioning of multiple neurotransmitter systems, particularly serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis. Fifth, there's an altered relationship to time and possibility. Depression compresses the psychological future. It's difficult, when depressed, to imagine that things will be different, better, or that effort will matter. The past becomes a source of regret and recrimination. The present feels heavy and meaningless. It's important to note that clinical depression exists on a continuum with normal sadness and grief. Everyone experiences depressive episodes from time to time. Everyone has periods of low motivation, disrupted sleep, social withdrawal, and pessimistic thinking. What distinguishes clinical depression isn't the presence of these features, but their intensity, duration, and the degree to which they interfere with functioning. The neurobiological reality of depression. To understand depression evolutionarily, we need to understand what's actually happening in the brain during a depressive episode. This isn't about reducing depression to brain chemistry, a reductionist move that many evolutionary perspectives try to avoid, but rather about recognizing that depression involves coordinated changes across multiple brain systems, changes that are sophisticated, organized, and appear to involve many of the same neural circuits that evolved to handle specific adaptive problems. The depressed brain shows consistent patterns of altered activity and connectivity. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region most involved in planning, decision-making, and future-oriented thinking, shows reduced activity and reduced connectivity with other regions during depression. The amygdala, a region crucial for threat detection and emotional processing, typically shows increased activity and increased responsiveness to negative stimuli. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in error detection and conflict monitoring, shows hyperactivity. These aren't random or purely pathological changes, they're organized shifts in how the brain allocates resources and attention. At the neurochemical level, depression involves alterations in multiple neurotransmitter systems. Serotonin dysfunction has long been associated with depression, which is why selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are widely prescribed. However, the serotonin story is more complex than simple depletion. Rather, there appear to be alterations in serotonin signaling and in the systems that regulate serotonin sensitivity. Dopamine systems, crucial for motivation and reward processing, show reduced activity in depression. Norepinephrine, involved in arousal and attention, is often dysregulated. And the stress hormone cortisol, which is normally released in response to challenges but then returns to baseline, often shows abnormal patterns in depression, either elevated or dysregulated. The HPA axis, the system comprising the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands that coordinates the stress response, is frequently dysregulated in depression. This system evolved to help organisms respond to immediate threats. When you encounter a predator or competitor, your adrenal glands release adrenaline and cortisol, sharpening attention, increasing heart rate, mobilizing energy stores. But in depression, this system often remains activated or shows abnormal feedback regulation, as if the person's threat detection system has been set to a hair trigger or has gotten stuck in an activated state. Inflammation markers are often elevated in depression. Cytokines, immune signaling molecules, are elevated in many depressed individuals, and blocking these cytokines in animal models can reduce depressive-like behaviors. This has led some researchers to propose that depression involves an inflammatory component, though the causal direction and mechanisms remain debated. Connectivity between brain regions often shows characteristic patterns in depression. The default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate when we're not focused on external tasks, when we're thinking about ourselves, our past, and our future, often shows excessive activity and poor regulation in depression. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the temporal lobe. Increased activity in this network correlates with rumination and negative self-referential thinking. One of the most important neurobiological features of depression is altered reward processing. In the healthy brain, the prospect of positive outcomes activates reward circuits and motivates behavior. The nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area, and orbitofrontal cortex work together to encode the value of potential rewards and to drive approach behavior. In depression, these reward circuits show reduced responsiveness. This isn't just about feeling sad, it's about a fundamental alteration in how the brain processes value and motivation. Things that should matter, social connection, achievement, pleasure, lose their capacity to activate these motivational systems. This is why depression feels so flat, so devoid of motivation, even when the depressed person intellectually recognizes that they should want to do things. The stress response system also shows characteristic alterations. Under normal circumstances, when a threat passes, cortisol levels drop and the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system, reactivates. In depression, there's often a dysregulation of this recovery process. The system remains partially activated or shows abnormal daily rhythms. Over time, chronic activation of the stress response system leads to allostatic load, the wear and tear on the body from prolonged physiological stress. It's crucial to understand that these neurobiological changes aren't external impositions on the brain. They're the actual implementation of the depressive state. When we talk about depression evolutionarily, we're talking about these neural systems, these neurochemical patterns, these changes in connectivity and activity. We're asking, why would evolution wire the brain to produce these patterns in response to certain circumstances? Depression across cultures and history. Before we proceed with evolutionary theorizing, we need to establish that depression isn't simply a product of modern Western civilization, a disorder created by capitalism or psychiatry. Depression appears across all known cultures, across all time periods for which we have records. In ancient Egypt, medical papyri describe conditions that sound remarkably like depression, associated with imbalances of the four humors and treated with various remedies. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates and later Galen wrote extensively about melancholia as one of the four temperaments arising from an excess of black bile. Aristotle famously asked why all men of genius seem to suffer from melancholia, a question that still resonates today. Medieval Islamic physicians like Al-Razi and Avicenna described detailed accounts of what we would now call depression, including the distinction between sadness as a response to loss and a more pathological form of sadness that persists inappropriately. Medieval and Renaissance Europe spoke of acedia, a spiritual condition involving listlessness, despair, and the abandonment of meaning-making effort, which bears striking resemblance to depression as we understand it today. In traditional Chinese medicine, depression-like states were described under various names, including conditions involving imbalance of qi and disrupted flow through the meridian system. Ayurvedic medicine in India describes conditions of vata imbalance and tamas predominance that map onto what we would recognize as depression. Cross-cultural psychiatric research confirms that depression exists and is recognizable across diverse societies. While the specific phenomenology may vary, the cultural expression of depression differs across contexts, with some cultures emphasizing somatic symptoms more than others. The core features remain: loss of motivation, altered mood, disrupted sleep and appetite, social withdrawal, and a characteristic change in thinking. Importantly, depression isn't simply an affliction of modern developed nations. It occurs with substantial prevalence in developing countries, in pre-industrialized societies, and in hunter-gatherer groups that have been studied anthropologically. This cross-cultural and trans-historical presence suggests that depression taps into something fundamental about human psychology, not something created by modern conditions. That said, the prevalence and expression of depression may be influenced by social and economic factors. Rates of depression do appear higher in certain modern contexts, particularly in conditions of poverty, inequality, social disconnection, and meaninglessness. But the basic phenomenon appears to be universal. Depression in other animals. If depression is a human phenomenon shaped by evolution, we might expect to find something like depression in our evolutionary relatives and in other animals that face similar problems. And indeed, we do. Many animals show behaviors that researchers describe as depression-like. Rodents exposed to chronic stress show a syndrome characterized by reduced motivation, reduced response to rewards, altered sleep patterns, and reduced social engagement, a set of features that parallel depression in humans. These behaviors emerge reliably across different chronic stress protocols and respond to antidepressant medications, suggesting they may involve similar neural mechanisms. In primates, depression-like states have been observed, particularly in socially subordinate individuals and in animals experiencing loss or disruption of social bonds. Wild and captive primates show behaviors including social withdrawal, reduced activity, reduced response to environmental stimuli, and sometimes self-injurious behavior following social defeats. In some cases, these behaviors persist despite the absence of ongoing stress, suggesting they represent something more than an acute stress response. Captive elephants and cetaceans show behaviors that caretakers and researchers describe as consistent with depression: listlessness, stereotyped behaviors, reduced engagement with environment and social group, and sometimes what appears to be suicidal behavior, refusing food, moving into positions that allow self-harm. Given that these animals are known for their intelligence, social complexity, and emotional sophistication, the presence of something like depression might be expected. Some researchers have argued that anhedonia, the loss of pleasure and motivation, can be observed in many animal species. A rat that won't work for food that it previously valued, a dog that shows no interest in play or social interaction, a primate that withdraws from its group. These represent fundamental alterations in motivation and reward processing that transcend species boundaries. That said, we need to be cautious about assuming that depression-like behavior in animals is identical to human depression. Animals cannot report their subjective experience. We cannot know if they experience the existential despair, the rumination about past failures and future hopelessness, the sense of meaninglessness that often characterizes human depression. What we can say is that animals exhibit behavioral and neurobiological states that share significant features with human depression, and this suggests that depression-like phenomena have deep evolutionary roots. The evolution of human consciousness and emotion. To understand depression evolutionarily, we need to understand why emotions evolved at all, and why humans in particular developed such rich emotional and psychological lives. Emotions aren't luxuries or accidents. They're deeply adaptive mechanisms that evolved because they solved important problems for our ancestors. An emotion is best understood as an organized set of changes, physiological, cognitive, behavioral, and motivational, designed to address a particular type of problem or situation. Fear evolved to help us respond to threats. Anger evolved to help us overcome obstacles and assert our interests. Disgust evolved to help us avoid pathogens and toxins. Guilt and shame evolved to help us navigate social hierarchies and maintain group membership. In humans specifically, emotions became increasingly sophisticated and psychologically complex. Rather than simply being triggered by immediate stimuli, human emotions became bound up with abstract thought, imagination, memory, and social understanding. We can feel afraid of things that haven't happened yet, imagined futures that exist only in our minds. We can feel proud or ashamed not just about our own actions, but about our character, our status, our essential nature. We can feel grief not just for a present loss, but for potential futures that will never be. This expansion of emotional life in humans appears to be linked to the evolution of consciousness. The development of a subjective sense of self, the ability to represent and reflect on our own mental states, the capacity for abstract thought and symbolic meaning. With consciousness came possibilities for new forms of emotion and suffering, but also new possibilities for insight, meaning-making, and growth. Depression, understood evolutionarily, appears to be a byproduct or consequence of these more sophisticated psychological capacities. The very features of human consciousness that allow for great achievements, creativity, and meaning-making also create vulnerabilities. The ability to represent the future allows for hope, but also for anxiety and despair when the future seems impossibly bleak. The ability to reflect on our own performance allows for learning from mistakes, but also for shame and self-recrimination. The capacity for abstract meaning makes life rich, but also makes meaninglessness devastating. Ancestral environments and psychological problems. Our human minds evolved to solve problems in ancestral environments, the environments in which humans lived for most of human evolutionary history. For the vast majority of our evolutionary past, humans lived in small groups, typically 25 to 150 people, in face-to-face communities where social status, kinship bonds, and reputation were paramount. Resources were often scarce and unpredictable, mortality rates were high. Life expectancy was low by modern standards. In these ancestral environments, certain psychological problems would have been particularly significant. First, there was the problem of social status and hierarchical integration. Humans are fundamentally social animals with deep status concerns. Our place in the hierarchy affected our reproductive success, our resource access, our ability to mate, and to protect our offspring. Losing status was genuinely dangerous. Second, there was the problem of goal disengagement. Sometimes in ancestral environments, pursuing a particular goal became impossible. Maybe a competing group had taken over your hunting territory. Maybe the person you hoped to mate with chose someone else. Maybe illness or injury made your previous activities impossible. In such situations, continued pursuit of impossible goals would be wasteful and dangerous, burning energy and resources and time on endeavors that couldn't succeed. Third, there was the problem of extracting meaning and lessons from failure. When important goals were blocked, it was crucial to understand why, to analyze what went wrong, to learn lessons that might prevent similar failures in the future. This often required sustained attention to the failure, careful analysis, and the kind of rumination that might seem depressive to modern observers, but that served important functions in analyzing complex social and environmental problems. Fourth, there was the problem of social integration after status loss or transgression. If you lost status or violated group norms, you were in danger of ostracism or exile, which in ancestral environments could mean death. Signals of submission, remorse, and reintegration effort were crucial for surviving such periods. Fifth, there was the problem of energy conservation during times of scarcity. When resources were scarce, during food shortages, illness, or social disruption, the ability to conserve energy became crucial. This would involve reducing activity, reducing motivation-driven behavior, and shifting into a more passive, conserving mode. Depression, from an evolutionary perspective, might be understood as a collection of mechanisms designed to handle these ancestral problems. When faced with certain types of challenges, particularly social challenges, failure, status loss, or blocked goals, the brain engages a suite of responses that modern psychiatry calls depression, but that in ancestral contexts might have served important adaptive functions. The problem of multiple causation and context dependency. Before we present specific theories about depression's function, we need to acknowledge an important principle. Depression is not likely a unitary phenomenon with a single cause and function. Rather, depressive states might be triggered by multiple types of problems and might involve multiple mechanisms. Consider sadness, which we can use as a comparison. Sadness appears across many contexts: loss of a loved one, failure to achieve a goal, social rejection, disappointment. Yet despite the different triggers, sadness shares common features: reduced activity, social withdrawal, inward focus, rumination. The function of sadness, promoting acceptance of loss, signaling a need for social support, motivating analysis of what went wrong, might be similar across these different contexts. Similarly, depression might have multiple triggering conditions and multiple functions. Social defeat might trigger depression for different reasons than blocked goals or blocked goals, but they might all involve overlapping neural mechanisms and overlapping functions. This is important because it means we should be skeptical of theories that claim depression has one true function. Depression is likely multifunctional, serving different purposes in different contexts, sometimes helpful and sometimes harmful, sometimes appropriate to circumstances, and sometimes a malfunction. It also means that understanding depression evolutionarily doesn't reduce depression to a simple story. Evolution doesn't design clean, efficient systems. It works through variation and selection, maintaining multiple mechanisms that work well enough, sometimes creating systems with multiple overlapping functions, and sometimes creating maladaptive byproducts of adaptive mechanisms. The social rank theory. Depression as a subordination display. One of the most developed evolutionary theories of depression is the social rank theory, developed particularly by Paul Gilbert and others. This theory proposes that depression functions as a display of social subordination, a suite of behaviors and physiological changes designed to communicate submission and to manage relationships with higher status individuals. The logic of this theory is compelling. In social hierarchies, subordinate individuals need mechanisms to manage their lower status without provoking further aggression from dominance. Across many animal species, we see subordination displays, behaviors that communicate non-aggression, submission, and acceptance of the hierarchy. A dog rolling onto its back and exposing its belly is displaying submission. A wolf lowering its head and tucking its tail is communicating subordination. A chimpanzee producing pant grunts to a dominant is acknowledging the hierarchy. What might human subordination look like? According to the social rank theory, depression involves exactly such a display. Reduced activity, reduced assertiveness, social withdrawal, reduced eye contact, a diminished presence in the social group. These behaviors communicate that the person is no longer competing for dominance, is accepting a lower position in the hierarchy, and is not a threat to higher-ranking individuals. The person experiencing depression is, in effect, psychologically withdrawing from the competition for dominance. This theory makes several predictions. First, it predicts that depression should follow defeats or losses, and this prediction is supported by research. Unemployment, social rejection, romantic breakup, failure in important domains, these status-relevant losses frequently precipitate depression. Second, it predicts that the depressed person should show reduced assertiveness and approach motivation, which they do. Third, it predicts that depressive behaviors should function to reduce aggression from higher status individuals, which seems plausible, though this is harder to test directly in modern human contexts. The theory also explains some puzzling features of depression. Why does depression involve withdrawal from competition, but not necessarily a withdrawal from the group? The social rank theory suggests this is because the depressed person needs to remain in the group, complete isolation is dangerous, but needs to communicate non-competitiveness. So they remain socially present but behaviorally inhibited. Why does depression often follow interpersonal defeats in particular rather than just any loss? Because status losses at the hands of others in one's social group have the most immediate implications for hierarchy and safety. The social rank theory also illuminates the relationship between depression and other psychological states. Shame, for instance, is closely related to depression and often appears alongside it. Shame functions as a signal of social transgression or status inadequacy, and it often precedes depressive withdrawal. Subordination and shame might be related states on a continuum. This theory is powerful, but it has limitations. It explains situational or reactive depression well, depression that follows identifiable losses or defeats. It's less clear how it explains endogenous depression, depression that seems to arise without obvious social triggers. It also doesn't fully explain the rumination and altered cognition that characterize depression. Why would a subordination display necessarily involve negative self-focused thinking? And it arguably overemphasizes the adaptive nature of depression. The theory can sometimes minimize the genuine maladaptive aspects of depressive episodes. The bargaining model: depression as goal disengagement. A related but somewhat different evolutionary theory proposes that depression functions as a mechanism for disengaging from impossible or costly goals. This theory, developed by Adrian Wakefield and others, is based on the bargaining theory developed in evolutionary contexts more broadly. The logic is this: in ancestral environments, pursuing impossible goals was wasteful and dangerous. If you were stranded in a harsh environment and had settled on a goal that couldn't be achieved, finding a specific resource that didn't exist, reaching a destination blocked by an uncrossable barrier, continuing to pursue that goal would burn energy and resources while reducing your chances of finding alternative solutions. Over evolutionary time, natural selection should favor mechanisms that allow organisms to recognize when a goal has become too costly or impossible to achieve, and to disengage from that goal in favor of other objectives. This would involve reducing motivation for the blocked goal, shifting attention and effort to alternative pathways, and accepting the loss psychologically. Depression, according to this model, is exactly such a mechanism. When important goals become blocked, whether due to external barriers or internal incapacity, depression functions to forcefully disengage from those goals. The reduced motivation, the loss of pleasure, the focus on internal analysis rather than external action, all of these serve to shift the person away from pursuing the impossible goal and toward either developing alternative goals or coming to terms with the loss. This theory explains several features of depression well. It explains why depression often follows goal-blocking events, failure, loss, blocked opportunities. It explains why depression involves reduced motivation specifically for approach behaviors and goal pursuit. It explains the rumination that characterizes depression. The person is analyzing what went wrong with the original goal pursuit and potentially developing new goals or strategies. The theory also explains age-related patterns in depression. Younger people, with longer time horizons and more future opportunities, might show less depression following goal-blocking events because they have more time to develop alternative goals. Older people, with shorter time horizons, might show more depression when important life path goals become impossible because the opportunity to develop alternatives is limited. This theory also provides an explanation for why depression and realistic thinking sometimes coincide. When people are pursuing impossible goals, depressive realism, the more accurate perception of actual probabilities and actual efficacy, functions to recognize that the goal is indeed impossible. This recognition is painful but necessary for adaptive goal disengagement. Again, this theory has limitations. It's somewhat unclear how depression as a goal disengagement mechanism would necessarily involve the full constellation of depressive symptoms: the sleep disruption, the physiological changes, the inflammatory markers. Why wouldn't simple motivation reduction suffice? The theory also struggles to explain why depression sometimes persists even when alternative goals become available, or why depressed individuals sometimes maintain motivational pursuit of other goals while showing general depressive symptoms. The bargaining model expanded: social negotiation and reconciliation. Another evolutionary perspective suggests that depression functions in social negotiation and reconciliation, particularly after conflicts or defeats. This view, developed by some researchers in the context of bargaining theory in evolutionary biology, proposes that depression represents a costly signal of capitulation, remorse, or reconciliation intent. The logic here involves the economics of signaling. When you've lost a conflict with someone more powerful, or when you've transgressed against your group, you need to signal that you're no longer a threat, that you genuinely intend to respect their authority, that you're genuinely remorseful. But mere words aren't credible. You might simply be saying what they want to hear while planning future defection or revenge. Costly signals are signals that are difficult or expensive to fake. They're believable precisely because producing them costs something real. Depression, as a costly signal, might function to demonstrate genuine capitulation and remorse. By engaging in behaviors that are costly, by reducing activity and motivation, by losing interest in pleasures, by showing visible suffering, the depressed person demonstrates that they're not faking their acceptance of the new situation. They're genuinely affected. This theory provides interesting explanations for several depressive phenomena. It explains why depression often follows interpersonal conflicts or defeats. These are precisely the situations where costly signaling of remorse would be most valuable. It explains why depression involves visible, costly changes in behavior rather than simply being a private mental state. The signal only works if others observe it. And it explains why depression sometimes functions to repair relationships and restore social integration. The costly signal of remorse opens possibilities for reconciliation. The theory suggests that depression in this context is ultimately a social strategy, a way of managing relationships with higher status individuals or with the group more broadly. This doesn't mean the depressed person is consciously deploying depression as a strategy. Rather, the evolved mechanisms that produce depression in certain contexts are designed, by evolution, to solve these social negotiation problems. Again, this theory has important limitations. It's difficult to test empirically whether depression truly functions as a costly signal, or whether depressed individuals actually show better social reconciliation. The theory also potentially overemphasizes the adaptive or strategic nature of depression in a way that might minimize genuine suffering or might suggest that depressed individuals should get over it if reconciliation is supposed to happen. The analytical rumination hypothesis, depression as a thinking tool. A quite different evolutionary perspective on depression focuses on the cognitive features, particularly rumination and negative thinking, and proposes that these serve an analytical function. This hypothesis, developed by Paul Andrews and colleagues, suggests that depressive rumination functions to help people analyze and solve complex problems. The logic is that rumination, the sustained, repetitive focus on a problem, its causes, and its implications, is actually an evolved cognitive mechanism designed to address the kinds of complex social and strategic problems that our ancestors faced. When you're facing a difficult interpersonal problem, a strategic mistake, or a complex life situation, sustained analytical thinking can help you understand what went wrong and how to prevent it in the future. Depression, according to this view, involves a shift into a problem-focused mode of thinking. The reduced motivation for other activities means the person has more cognitive resources devoted to analyzing the problem. The rumination focuses attention on the problem and its causes. The negative thinking, while painful, reflects a more realistic assessment of threats and problems, depressive realism. The social withdrawal creates space for this analytical thinking without the distractions of social engagement. This hypothesis makes several interesting predictions. It predicts that depressive rumination should be more likely to follow complex social problems that benefit from analysis, and research supports this. It predicts that rumination should actually help with problem-solving and perspective-taking in these contexts, and some research supports this as well. It predicts that depressive thinking should become less depressive once an insight or solution emerges, which also appears to happen. The hypothesis also provides an explanation for why depression and intelligence sometimes correlate, why creative and insightful people sometimes suffer from depression, and why depression is often accompanied by deep thinking about meaning, mortality, and existential issues. These depressive ruminations, while painful, might actually serve important functions for individuals predisposed to analytical thinking. However, this hypothesis also has significant limitations. Most obviously, it doesn't explain why rumination so often fails to produce solutions, why depressed people remain stuck in their rumination without achieving insight or problem-solving. It also doesn't fully explain the physiological and neurobiological changes in depression, why the analytical rumination would need to be accompanied with sleep disruption, appetite changes, and inflammatory markers. And it potentially romanticizes depression as a thinking tool in a way that minimizes its genuine suffering and dysfunction. The energy conservation hypothesis, depression as a metabolic adaptation. This hypothesis, related to broader theories of life history trade-offs, proposes that depression functions to reduce energy expenditure and metabolic demands during times of stress, scarcity, or illness. The logic is rooted in basic evolutionary biology. Every organism faces trade-offs in how it allocates limited energy resources. Energy spent on activity is energy not spent on reproduction, immune function, or growth. Natural selection should favor mechanisms that allow organisms to shift into a lower metabolism state during times when conditions are poor or when the cost of activity is high. In humans, depression might represent such a shift. The reduced activity, the loss of motivation for energetically expensive behaviors, the fatigue and withdrawal, all of these would conserve energy. This might be particularly advantageous during times of illness, injury, or social stress, when the immune system and stress response systems are already demanding significant resources. This hypothesis is supported by several pieces of evidence. Depression is often accompanied with illness and occurs more frequently during times of physiological stress. Chronic illness depression is extremely common. The inflammatory markers often elevated in depression might partly reflect the activation of immune responses during illness, to which depression might be an appropriate response. The hypothesis also aligns with life history theory, which predicts that organisms should shift resource allocation in response to environmental conditions. The energy conservation hypothesis also provides a perspective on why depression might involve anhedonia, the loss of pleasure. Anhedonia could function to reduce approach motivation and conserve energy by reducing engagement with rewards. Even when pleasurable things are available, the depressed brain is deciding that the energy cost of pursuing them is too high given current circumstances. However, this hypothesis also has limitations. It's not clear why energy conservation would need to involve the full constellation of depressive symptoms. Cognitive changes, mood changes, and social withdrawal all seem to go beyond what would be needed for simple metabolic downregulation. The hypothesis also raises questions about depression that occurs during times of relative plenty, or depression in individuals who lack obvious physiological stressors. And it's unclear why depression, as an energy conservation mechanism, wouldn't be more precisely calibrated to actual energy demands, rather than persisting even when energy becomes available. The immune challenge hypothesis, depression as sickness behavior. A related hypothesis proposes that depression is actually an expression of sickness behavior, the set of behavioral and physiological changes that occur during illness. This perspective draws on research showing that infections and immune challenges trigger a syndrome in animals and humans that includes fatigue, loss of motivation, reduced social engagement, fever in some cases, and depressed mood. This syndrome, called sickness behavior, appears to be an adaptive response to infection. By reducing activity, social engagement, and motivation for non-essential activities, organisms can conserve energy and allocate resources to fighting the infection. The altered cognition and mood might also serve to promote rest and recovery. Depression, according to this hypothesis, might be what happens when sickness behavior gets activated inappropriately or chronically. This could occur through several mechanisms: chronic activation of immune systems due to low-grade infections, parasites, or autoimmune conditions, activation of immune responses during psychological stress, or dysregulation of the immune signaling systems that normally shut off sickness behavior once the infection is cleared. This hypothesis is supported by evidence showing that depressed individuals often have elevated inflammatory markers, that depression is more common in conditions of chronic illness, and that anti-inflammatory treatments sometimes show antidepressant effects. The hypothesis also explains why depression involves fatigue and lack of motivation. These are the core features of sickness behavior. However, this hypothesis also has limitations. Most depressed individuals don't have obvious infections or immune challenges, and while some depressed individuals show elevated inflammation, many don't. The hypothesis also struggles to explain the more complex cognitive features of depression, like rumination about past failures or existential concerns, which don't obviously relate to sickness behavior. The social signal hypothesis, depression as communication. A somewhat different perspective proposes that depression functions primarily as a form of social communication. This view suggests that the depressive state, the visible changes in behavior, the communicated suffering, the social withdrawal, functions to communicate important information to others in the social group. According to this hypothesis, depression communicates several messages. First, it communicates that the person is not currently a threat and is not competing for dominance, similar to the social rank theory but focused more on the communicative function. Second, it communicates genuine suffering and need, potentially signaling that the person requires social support, care, or accommodation. Third, it communicates that something is wrong, that the situation requires attention or change, that the normal mode of operation cannot continue. This hypothesis draws on research showing that depression and depressive behavior have effects on other people. People tend to respond to depressed individuals with increased caregiving, reduced demands, and attempts at support and encouragement. Family members and friends often modify their behavior toward depressed individuals, reducing their expectations and increasing their emotional engagement. From an evolutionary perspective, depression might function to elicit these caregiving and supportive responses. This doesn't mean depression is a manipulative strategy in a conscious sense. Rather, the hypothesis suggests that the evolved mechanisms producing depression are designed by evolutionary selection to trigger caregiving responses in others. This would be particularly adaptive for individuals facing illness, injury, or overwhelming challenges, situations where social support is genuinely crucial for survival. The social signal hypothesis also explains why depression often improves when the depressed person receives genuine support and validation, or when their situation materially improves. The signal has done its job. It has communicated the need, and if others respond appropriately, the need for the signal diminishes. However, this hypothesis also has important limitations. It doesn't fully explain why depression persists even when support is available or even actively offered. It doesn't explain why depression so often occurs in isolation and contexts where social communication is minimal. And the hypothesis potentially risks pathologizing normal help-seeking behavior or suggesting that depressed individuals are somehow responsible for their depression because it's a communication. Integration, depression as a multi-system response. Rather than proposing that depression has a single function, a more integrative perspective suggests that depression involves multiple partially overlapping mechanisms, each addressing different adaptive problems. In this view, depression is not a unitary syndrome with a unitary function, but rather a collection of mechanisms that often co-occur, particularly in certain types of circumstances. According to this integrative view, depression might involve status management systems that reduce competitive motivation and communicate subordination, particularly after social defeats or status losses. These systems are particularly engaged when the depressed person is embedded in social hierarchies where managing status is crucial. Goal disengagement systems that reduce motivation for blocked or impossible goals, allowing psychological acceptance and the redirection of effort toward alternative objectives. These systems are particularly engaged when important goals have become blocked or unachievable. Analytical systems that promote sustained, focused thinking about problems and solutions, withdrawing motivation from other activities to free cognitive resources. These systems are particularly engaged when complex problems require analysis. Energy conservation systems that reduce metabolic expenditure and redirect resources to immune function and stress recovery. These systems are particularly engaged during illness, injury, or chronic stress. Social communication systems that signal suffering, subordination, and need, potentially triggering caregiving responses in others. These systems are potentially engaged in multiple contexts, but particularly when the depressed person has genuine needs and when others are present to respond. In ancestral environments, these systems would often have been functional. They would have addressed real adaptive problems. A person experiencing social defeat would benefit from the status management aspects of depression. A person facing goal blocking would benefit from disengagement. A person trying to solve a complex social problem might benefit from the analytical focus. A person facing illness would benefit from energy conservation. But in modern contexts and in the absence of appropriate environmental triggers or resolution, these same systems can become maladaptive. When status management systems remain activated long after social integration has been restored, depression becomes dysfunctional. When goal disengagement systems remain engaged long after acceptable alternative goals have emerged, depression persists inappropriately. When analytical systems keep the person ruminating on problems that have no solution, the rumination becomes destructive. When energy conservation systems remain activated long after the crisis has passed, they become pathological. The concept of evolutionary mismatch. One of the most important concepts in evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychology is the idea of evolutionary mismatch, the situation where our evolved mechanisms are operating in environments radically different from the ancestral environments in which they evolved. Our brains, our bodies, our emotional systems evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in ancestral environments characterized by specific features: small social groups, face-to-face interaction, relatively stable social hierarchies, direct connection between effort and resource acquisition, clear feedback about successes and failures, minimal technology, high mortality rates, and strong connections to kin and community. Modern environments, particularly in developed nations, are radically different. Large-scale anonymous societies, mediated communication, fluid hierarchies, disconnection between effort and outcome, often unclear feedback, overwhelming technology and information, low mortality rates, and often weak or fragmented community and kin bonds. This mismatch doesn't mean that evolved mechanisms are useless in modern contexts. Many work quite well. But some work less well, and some can become actively pathological when activated in the modern context but unable to achieve their ancestral functions. Depression provides a clear example of this mismatch. The mechanisms that produce depression appear to have evolved to handle specific types of challenges: social defeats in small groups, goal blocking, need for social support, status negotiation. But in modern contexts, these same mechanisms can be triggered inappropriately, can persist without resolution, and can create suffering without adaptive benefit. How modern life triggers depressive mechanisms. Consider how modern life might activate the social rank status management aspects of depression. In ancestral environments, social defeat was typically temporary and followed by reintegration or migration to a new group. But modern social defeats can be persistent and publicly visible in new ways. A person can experience professional failure that affects their status not just in their immediate group but in their broader industry. Social media makes public embarrassment possible in ways that would have been unthinkable ancestrally. The status hierarchies of modern work, education, and social media are often pervasive and inescapable. Moreover, in ancestral contexts, after a period of appropriate subordination, status could often be regained through various mechanisms: migration, alliance formation, improved performance, or sometimes simply the passage of time and the natural turnover of hierarchies. In modern contexts, status losses can be more permanent. Permanent unemployment in a context where employment status determines social position. Failed education in a context where educational credentials determine life trajectory. Public humiliation that persists in digital form indefinitely. When the mechanisms that produce depressive subordination display remain activated in such contexts, with no prospect of status recovery, depression can become chronic. Similarly, consider goal disengagement mechanisms. In ancestral contexts, goals were typically constrained: finding a mate from your social group, acquiring resources through hunting or gathering, maintaining status in your hierarchy. These goals were often achievable through appropriate effort and strategy. When a goal became impossible, there were usually alternative goals available and achievable. In modern contexts, goal structures have changed. People often maintain goals that are culturally defined but not directly achievable through personal effort. achieving a specific level of wealth or income in contexts where outcomes depend partly on luck and social connections, achieving certain types of status or recognition that may not be available despite effort, finding a specific type of romantic partner in contexts where the search is mediated by apps and algorithms, or maintaining contact and relationship with family and friends scattered geographically in ways that were impossible ancestrally. Moreover, modern culture often encourages continued pursuit of specific goals even when they've become functionally impossible. There's pressure to keep trying, to have faith, to not give up. This cultural message, while motivating in some contexts, can be maladaptive when applied to genuinely impossible goals. The goal disengagement mechanisms that evolved to help us let go of blocked goals are actively overridden by cultural messages to persist. The analytical/rumination aspects of depression are similarly mismatched with modern contexts in some ways. Rumination about a complex interpersonal problem in an ancestral group of 50 people, where the people involved are known and the consequences of misunderstanding are high, might have genuine value. But rumination about social media interactions, internet arguments with strangers, or perceived slights from distant acquaintances likely provides little adaptive benefit and can consume enormous cognitive resources. The energy conservation aspects of depression might be particularly mismatched with modern conditions in developed nations, where food is abundant and physical energy conservation is rarely crucial for survival. When the energy conservation mechanisms are activated by stress, including modern psychological stresses, but the body doesn't need to conserve energy because food is available, depression can persist as a dysregulated hangover of mechanisms that once had clear adaptive value. Chronic stress and allostatic load. One important mechanism through which modern life may produce depression is through chronic stress and what researchers call allostatic load, the wear and tear on the body and brain from prolonged activation of stress response systems. In ancestral environments, stress was typically acute and episodic. A predator appeared, you responded with fear and appropriate behavior, the threat passed, and your stress response systems downregulated. A social conflict occurred, you engaged with it and achieved some resolution or separation, and you recovered. This pattern of acute stress followed by recovery appears to be what the stress response systems evolved to handle. Modern life, particularly for people experiencing ongoing adversity, involves chronic stress, ongoing financial strain, ongoing social difficulties, ongoing uncertainty about status and security, ongoing exposure to negative information through media. The stress response systems designed for acute threats become chronically activated. The HPA axis remains partially engaged, inflammatory markers remain elevated, the brain regions involved in threat detection and fear remain hyperactive. Over time, chronic stress activation leads to allostatic load, the cumulative damage from ongoing physiological stress. The prefrontal cortex, which requires sustained high-energy neurons to function, can show degradation under chronic stress. The hippocampus, crucial for memory and context, can shrink. The amygdala, the fear center, can grow and become more reactive. The immune system can dysregulate. Cardiovascular function can deteriorate. Depression often emerges in the context of chronic stress and allostatic load. In this context, depression might be understood partly as the brain's response to chronic activation of threat and stress systems, a maladaptive consequence of running stress response mechanisms continuously in an environment where no amount of stress response can resolve the underlying problems. Social disconnection and meaning loss. Another key way modern life might produce depression is through social disconnection and loss of meaning. Humans evolved in contexts where social connection was automatic and inevitable. You were born into a kin group, lived your entire life in a face-to-face community, and your survival and status depended on that community. Community bonds, family relationships, and group membership provided structure, meaning, and support. Modern life, particularly in developed nations and in urban contexts, has fractured these connections. People are geographically mobile, moving away from childhood communities for education and work. Extended family bonds are often attenuated. Workplace relationships are often transactional rather than deeply bonded. Leisure time is often spent alone with technology rather than in community. The default is disconnection, and connection requires active effort and often fails to materialize anyway. This social disconnection is particularly problematic because humans appear to have evolved psychological mechanisms that depend on strong social bonds. Belonging, connection, having a place in a group, these appear to be psychological necessities, not luxuries. When chronically disconnected, people show increased depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. Similarly, meaning appears to depend partly on connection to something larger than oneself. Traditional sources of meaning, religious community, extended family networks, stable communities, clear cultural narratives about the good life and one's place in it, have been weakened or lost for many people in modern societies. The loss of traditional meaning structures often occurs precisely at the point in the life cycle, adolescence and early adulthood, when individuals are forming their sense of identity and purpose. Depression in this context might be partly understood as an appropriate response to genuine loss of community, loss of meaning, loss of connection. The depressive withdrawal, the questioning of meaning, the sense of emptiness might reflect genuine absence rather than pure malfunction. Information overload and perpetual threat. Modern humans are also exposed to information about threats and challenges at an unprecedented level. Throughout ancestral history, humans' awareness of danger was limited to their immediate environment and their immediate community. Now, through media and technology, we're exposed to information about thousands or millions of threats: distant wars, climate disasters, crime, disease outbreaks, political instability, economic uncertainty. The threat detection systems of the human brain evolved to notice genuine threats in one's immediate environment and to trigger appropriate responses. But when exposed to constant information about distant threats that one can't actually do anything about, the threat detection systems remain chronically activated. One can't fight or flee threats one reads about on the internet. But the systems remain primed, the amygdala remains reactive, the threat narrative continues. For people with underlying vulnerabilities to depression, whether genetic or experiential, this chronic activation of threat systems, combined with the sense of powerlessness and inability to affect distant problems, can push toward depressive withdrawal. The rumination becomes focused on unsolvable, overwhelming problems. The motivation to engage with the world diminishes, partly because the world is presented as overwhelmingly threatening. The complexity of modern goal structures. Another aspect of modern life that may contribute to depression is the complexity and often contradictory nature of modern goal structures. In ancestral environments, goals were relatively straightforward and widely shared: find resources, maintain status, secure a mate, support family. Modern culture presents individuals with a vast array of possible goals, often culturally contradictory, and with unclear connection between effort and outcomes. A person might be encouraged to pursue professional success while also maintaining close family relationships, to be ambitious while also content, to achieve financial security while also finding meaningful work, to be independent while also maintaining community, to be confident while also aware of one's limitations. When goals are contradictory, the cognitive and motivational systems face an impossible task. The result can be internal conflict, anxiety, and eventually depression as the person recognizes the impossibility of fully satisfying all the cultural directives. Moreover, many modern goals are structured in ways that guarantee failure. The aspiration to be in the top tier of income earners is, by mathematical necessity, an aspiration only a small percentage can achieve. The aspiration to be exceptionally beautiful or exceptional in appearance, in a culture saturated with professionally edited and digitally altered images, is essentially impossible to achieve. The aspiration to achieve celebrity or widespread recognition in a world where billions seek such recognition is unattainable for nearly everyone. When people pursue goals that are essentially impossible and that failure is essentially guaranteed, the goal disengagement mechanisms of depression might be repeatedly triggered. But unlike ancestral goal blocking, which was often temporary and could be addressed through alternative goals, modern goal blockade can be pervasive. Multiple important life goals might simultaneously seem unachievable, creating a kind of cascading goal failure that the depressive systems are unable to resolve. The role of autonomy and control. Depression is also associated with loss of control and reduced autonomy. In ancestral environments, individuals in low-status positions certainly had limited autonomy, but there was typically some sphere of control. One could improve hunting skills, form alliances, raise children. Modern systems of employment, bureaucracy, and institutional control often provide even less sense of agency. A worker in a large organization might feel that their work is meaningless, that their efforts don't matter, that they have no say in the structure or direction of their labor. A person navigating medical systems, welfare systems, or criminal justice systems might feel completely at the mercy of forces they can't control or understand. A student in a large educational institution might feel like a number rather than a person, their success or failure determined partly by factors completely outside their control. Research on depression consistently finds that loss of control, learned helplessness, and reduced sense of agency are associated with depression. This might not be a malfunction, but rather an appropriate response to genuinely limited control. When one's efforts genuinely don't matter because outcomes are determined by impersonal forces, the motivation to exert effort reasonably diminishes. When one has little control over one's circumstances, the depression might reflect this reality accurately. The implications of evolutionary understanding for treatment. If depression has evolutionary origins and often involves activation of mechanisms that were ancestrally adaptive, what does this mean for how we treat depression? First, and most importantly, understanding depression evolutionarily should not lead to minimizing depression or suggesting that depressed people should simply accept their depressive state. Evolution doesn't produce optimal outcomes. Mechanisms that were adaptive ancestrally can become maladaptive in modern contexts. Just because depression once had a function doesn't mean depression is good or desirable now. Rather, evolutionary understanding should inform how we approach treatment by helping us understand what the depressive mechanisms are trying to accomplish and how to address those underlying issues rather than just suppressing the symptoms. For depression following social defeat or status loss, understanding the social rank theory suggests that part of the solution involves addressing the actual status situation, either helping the person regain status through recovery in their area of deficit, helping them find alternative communities where they have higher status, or helping them develop a sense of meaning and value that isn't entirely contingent on hierarchical status. Research supports that depression following unemployment, for instance, can be improved not just by medication, but by actually re-entering employment or developing alternative sources of meaning and identity. For depression involving goal blockade, understanding the goal disengagement mechanism suggests that depression might be an appropriate signal that the old goals need to be released and new goals developed. Rather than simply trying to elevate mood and reinvigorate motivation for the blocked goal, treatment might involve helping the person grieve the loss of the old goal, explore what that goal represented, and identify new goals that might be achievable and meaningful. Therapeutic approaches that help people examine their goals and values, like acceptance and commitment therapy, might be particularly well suited to this type of depression. For depression involving rumination about problems, understanding the analytical rumination hypothesis suggests that the rumination might have some value but might also be dysregulated. Treatment might involve helping the person distinguish between productive analysis, which leads to insights and potential solutions, and unproductive rumination, which cycles without resolution. It might involve helping them actually solve the problems their brain is focused on, or alternatively, helping them redirect their attention when the rumination isn't productive. For depression involving chronic stress and allostatic load, treatment should involve addressing the chronic stress. This might include medication or meditation to help downregulate stress response systems, but it should also include addressing the actual stressors if possible, whether that means changing job situations, addressing ongoing conflicts, or working to reduce exposure to threatening information. For depression involving social disconnection and meaning loss, evolutionary understanding suggests that treatment should involve rebuilding connection and meaning. This might involve helping people reconnect with their families, finding or building community, engaging in spiritual or philosophical practices that provide meaning, or developing volunteer roles and community contributions that provide a sense of purpose. Psychotherapy and the restoration of adaptation. Psychotherapy, when effective, appears to work partly by helping people address the actual problems that are triggering depressive mechanisms. A person dealing with grief is helped to process the loss and gradually find meaning after loss. A person dealing with social conflict is helped to either repair relationships or to accept the loss of the relationship and move forward. A person facing goal blockade is helped to grieve the goal and identify alternative life directions. Different forms of psychotherapy might be particularly useful for different types of depression. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps people identify and change maladaptive thinking patterns, might be particularly useful for depression involving unrealistic thinking or maladaptive goal pursuit. Interpersonal therapy, which helps people navigate relationship issues, might be particularly useful for depression following social conflicts or losses. Existential therapy, which helps people explore questions of meaning and death, might be particularly useful for depression involving meaning loss. Acceptance and commitment therapy, which helps people accept what they cannot change while pursuing valued goals, might be particularly useful for depression involving goal blockade. The effectiveness of psychotherapy in treating depression suggests that when depressive mechanisms are addressed at the level of the actual problems they're responding to, when the social situation is repaired, when the goal blockade is addressed, when meaning is restored, when social connection is reestablished, the depressive symptoms often improve. This is consistent with an evolutionary perspective, suggesting that depression is, in some cases, an appropriate response to actual problems. Pharmacological treatment and mechanism of action. Antidepressant medications, primarily SSRIs and other serotonin-modulating drugs, are effective at reducing depressive symptoms in a significant proportion of people who take them. But the precise mechanism by which these drugs work remains somewhat unclear. The original serotonin hypothesis of depression, the idea that depression is simply caused by low serotonin and that increasing serotonin restores normal function, is now recognized as too simplistic. From an evolutionary perspective, antidepressant medications might work through several mechanisms. They might help dampen the overactivity of threat detection systems, allowing the person to engage with life despite ongoing stressors. They might help restore motivation and goal pursuit capacity, allowing the person to take actions that lead to the restoration of status, social connection, or meaning. They might help reduce rumination, allowing the person to redirect attention when rumination isn't productive. Importantly, antidepressant medications don't necessarily address the underlying problems that triggered depression. A person can be on antidepressants while remaining in an unemployment situation, an unhealthy relationship, or a meaningless job. The medications can restore enough motivation and mood to allow the person to function, but if the underlying situation isn't addressed, symptoms often return when the medication is stopped. This suggests that while antidepressant medications can be valuable, particularly for severe depression where the person lacks sufficient motivation to engage in the activities that would address underlying problems, or for depression triggered by factors that can't be quickly addressed, they should ideally be combined with interventions that address the underlying problems. The problem of over-medicalization. One concern with the modern approach to depression is that it sometimes medicalizes depressive responses to genuinely difficult circumstances. A person experiencing depression after genuine loss, after genuine failure, after genuine social rejection, or in response to genuinely difficult life circumstances is often treated as if they have a medical disease that should be fixed with medication. This medicalization approach has both benefits and costs. The benefit is that it reduces shame by framing depression as a medical issue rather than a character flaw or failure. The cost is that it can minimize the real problems that are causing depression and suggest that the solution is to feel better despite the underlying circumstances not changing. An evolutionary perspective suggests the need for more nuance. Sometimes depression is a response to actual problems and is signaling that the person's current situation is unsustainable or that important changes need to be made. In such cases, treating the depression without addressing the underlying situation might not be ideal. Sometimes depression persists even after the situation has improved, or even when circumstances are objectively acceptable, suggesting dysregulation of depressive mechanisms. In such cases, treatment focused on the mechanism itself, whether through medication or through helping the person change their thinking patterns and behavioral responses, makes more sense. The most sophisticated approach to depression likely involves assessment of both the actual circumstances and the functioning of depressive mechanisms, with treatment tailored accordingly. Depression and culture. While depression appears to be universal across cultures, its expression, triggers, and meaning vary significantly across different cultural contexts. This variation provides important information about how culturally specific factors interact with evolved mechanisms. In some cultures, depression is expressed predominantly through somatic symptoms, physical pain, fatigue, dizziness, rather than through mood or cognitive complaints. This doesn't mean these individuals aren't really depressed. Rather, it reflects cultural frameworks for understanding and expressing suffering. In Western psychological contexts, there's been an emphasis on mood and cognition as central to depression, but this reflects Western cultural contexts and not universal truths about depression. Different cultures also vary in how they frame and understand the causes of depression. In Western individualistic cultures, depression is often understood as an individual problem caused by individual factors, brain chemistry, personal psychology, individual trauma. In more collectivist cultures, depression might be understood as a problem involving social relationships, family dynamics, or one's role in the community. These different framings aren't just linguistic, they reflect genuine differences in how the condition develops and how it might best be addressed. Different cultures also vary in which types of goal blockade, status loss, or social disruption are most likely to trigger depression. In cultures where occupational success is central to identity, occupational failure is particularly likely to trigger depression. In cultures where family honor and reputation are central, shame and social rejection trigger depression. In cultures where religious faith is central to meaning, spiritual crises trigger depression. These cultural variations suggest that while depression involves evolved mechanisms, the triggers for those mechanisms are partly culturally determined. The evolved mechanisms respond to culturally significant loss and failure, because what matters varies by culture, and natural selection in ancestral environments didn't produce mechanisms that were rigid about what should trigger depressive responses. Individual differences in depression vulnerability. Just as depression varies across cultures, it also varies significantly across individuals. Some people appear highly vulnerable to depression, experiencing multiple episodes across their lifetime in response to relatively moderate stressors. Others remain depression-free despite significant adversities. Understanding the sources of these individual differences provides insights into depression mechanisms. Genetic factors clearly play a role in depression vulnerability. Twin studies consistently show that identical twins are more similar in depression vulnerability than fraternal twins, suggesting genetic influences. The heritability of depression is estimated around 35 to 40%, meaning that genetic factors account for a significant but not determining portion of the variation in depression risk. This is important. Genetic influences are significant but not determinative. Most people with genetic vulnerabilities to depression don't develop depression. Most people with depression don't have strong family histories of depression. What aspects of psychology or neurobiology might be genetically influenced and increase depression vulnerability? Possibilities include sensitivity of stress response systems. People with hair-trigger threat detection might be more prone to depression. Reward sensitivity. People with less responsive reward systems might be more prone to anhedonia. Sensitivity to social cues and threat. People more attuned to social rejection might be more prone to status-related depression. Or temperament and personality traits. People high in neuroticism, low in extroversion, or high in conscientiousness might be more prone to depression. Early life experiences also profoundly influence depression vulnerability. Childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, or early loss creates increased risk for depression throughout the lifespan. This appears to operate partly through effects on stress response system development. Children who experience early adversity develop stress response systems that are more reactive, more easily triggered, and less able to recover. As adults, these individuals are more prone to depression in response to stress. This early programming likely has evolutionary logic. Children developing in harsh, threatening environments benefit from stress response systems that are vigilant and reactive. This helped them survive in dangerous contexts. But these same hyper-reactive systems create vulnerability to depression in adulthood if adversity continues or if the person moves to safer environments where such vigilance is no longer adaptive. Cognitive styles and personality traits also influence depression vulnerability. People with ruminating cognitive styles, the tendency to repeatedly go over problems without reaching resolution, show increased depression risk. People high in neuroticism, the tendency to experience negative emotions intensely, show increased depression risk. People with perfectionism show increased depression risk. People who derive their self-worth primarily from achievement show increased risk, particularly when facing achievement challenges. These cognitive and personality factors might partly reflect the same mechanisms we discussed as potentially functional in ancestral contexts but become problematic in modern contexts. Rumination might be adaptive analytical processing in some contexts but maladaptive unproductive cycling in others. Perfectionism might represent high standards that in some contexts lead to achievement and in others become impossible to satisfy. Neuroticism might reflect heightened sensitivity to threats and to one's own functioning, valuable in some ancestral contexts but leading to excessive worry in modern contexts. Coping styles and behavioral responses also influence depression outcomes. People who respond to stress through active coping, trying to solve the problem, seeking social support, reframing the situation, show better depression outcomes than people who respond through passive coping, rumination, or avoidance. This suggests that depression outcomes are influenced not just by the presence of stressors, but by how people respond to those stressors. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. In ancestral contexts, active coping, doing something about problems, often led to solutions. Passive rumination might sometimes have helped with problem analysis, but persistent passive response without action would have been maladaptive. Modern humans still carry these predispositions. Those whose inherited coping styles lean toward action show better outcomes. Gender differences in depression are also significant. Women experience depression at roughly twice the rate of men. This difference emerges during adolescence and persists through adulthood. Several factors likely contribute to this difference. First, there are likely biological differences. Women's hormonal systems, particularly cyclical changes in estrogen and progesterone, appear to influence mood regulation. The postpartum period, when hormonal changes are dramatic, shows significantly elevated rates of depression. Some women show cyclical mood changes related to menstrual cycle phases. These biological factors don't fully explain the gender difference in depression, but appear to contribute. Second, there are likely social and cultural factors. In many cultures, girls and women face more constrained role options, more restriction on behavior, and more emphasis on appearance and social acceptance than boys and men. These restrictions might create more goal blockage and status concerns. Girls and women also report higher rates of sexual assault, harassment, and other forms of victimization, which can trigger depression. Third, there are likely gender differences in response styles. Women tend to report higher rates of rumination and internal focus, while men tend to report higher rates of behavioral action and external focus. In contexts where problems can't easily be solved through action, the rumination style might lead to worse outcomes. Additionally, there may be gender differences in help-seeking and treatment utilization, with women more likely to seek help and receive diagnoses, meaning some of the difference in prevalence rates might reflect differences in diagnoses rather than true differences in disorder prevalence. Understanding the depression vulnerability involves genetic, early experiential, cognitive, personality, behavioral, and cultural factors suggests that depression is genuinely multifactorial. Different people might be vulnerable for different reasons, and treatment might need to be tailored to the specific factors contributing to each person's depression. The historical association between depression and creativity. One of the most striking associations in the history of human achievement is the link between depression and creativity. From ancient descriptions of melancholic genius to modern research on depression in artists and intellectuals, there appears to be a robust relationship between depressive tendencies and creative achievement. Aristotle famously noted that all men who have attained excellence in philosophy, poetry, politics, and the arts have had a melancholic temperament. This observation has been echoed through centuries of cultural history. Romantics like Byron, Keats, and Shelley were understood as melancholic geniuses. Artists like Vincent van Gogh documented their struggles with depression alongside their creation of masterpieces. Modern research has found that artists, writers, musicians, and other creative professionals show elevated rates of mood disorders compared to the general population. This association is not merely cultural mythology. Research consistently finds correlations between depression or depressive temperament and creative achievement. People with higher levels of depressive symptoms show better performance on some creative tasks. People in creative professions show elevated rates of mood disorders. The association appears robust across different studies and different populations. How might an evolutionary perspective explain this association? The role of rumination and analytical thinking. One pathway from depression to creativity involves the cognitive features we discussed earlier. Depression involves sustained, focused attention on problems, rumination, and analytical thinking. While this rumination can be painful and unproductive, it also creates space for the kind of deep thinking that creative work often requires. Creative work typically requires the ability to sustain attention on complex problems, to consider multiple perspectives, to analyze and reanalyze ideas, and to find novel solutions to problems. These are exactly the cognitive processes that characterize depressive rumination. A person experiencing depression who is engaged in creative work might find that the rumination, rather than being purely destructive, can be channeled into the creative process. Moreover, depression often involves what we called depressive realism, a more accurate perception of reality, including threats, problems, and one's own limitations. For creative work that aims to depict reality, to grapple with genuine human problems, or to achieve authenticity, this more realistic perception might actually be valuable. An artist trying to depict genuine human suffering has better access to that suffering if experiencing depression. A writer trying to authentically represent struggle has direct access to struggle through their own experience. The role of reduced positive illusions. Related to depressive realism, depression typically involves a reduction in the positive illusions that characterize normal cognition. Most people maintain illusions about their own competence, control, and likelihood of positive outcomes. These illusions are psychologically beneficial, reducing anxiety and supporting motivation. But they can also limit perception and creativity. A person experiencing depression loses these illusions. They perceive their own limitations more accurately. They see the flaws in their work more clearly. They're aware of the difficulty of their creative projects and the unlikelihood of success. For a creative person, this clarity, while painful, can be valuable. It can drive the person toward higher standards, more authentic work, and deeper engagement with their material. The role of sensitivity and awareness. Depression often involves increased sensitivity to emotion, one's own and others. This heightened emotional sensitivity might also contribute to creativity. Artists, writers, and musicians need to be able to perceive subtle emotional nuances in order to depict them. Increased sensitivity to emotion, increased awareness of one's own feeling states, and increased attentiveness to the emotional states of others might all contribute to more sophisticated and authentic creative work. The danger of over-romanticism. However, it's crucial to avoid over-romanticizing the relationship between depression. While depression might sometimes enable certain types of creative insight or drive certain types of creative work, depression is also profoundly destructive. Severe depression interferes with creative work. Depression causes suffering. Depression is associated with suicide. The fact that some creative people experience depression doesn't mean depression is good or that depression should be embraced. Rather, what seems to be true is that certain personality and cognitive features that predispose people to depression, heightened sensitivity, analytical thinking, reduced positive illusions, introspection, also predispose people to creativity. These features have both adaptive and maladaptive aspects. They enable deep thinking and creative work, but they also create vulnerability to depression. The goal for individuals with these predispositions isn't to embrace depression, but to harness the strengths while managing the vulnerabilities. This might involve developing practices that allow for the focused, analytical thinking that characterizes both rumination and creative work, while avoiding the self-destructive aspects of rumination. It might involve building support systems and lifestyle practices that mitigate depression risk, while preserving the sensitivity and depth that enables creativity. The existential aspect of depression. One often overlooked aspect of depression is its existential dimension. Beyond the neurobiological changes, the motivational shifts, and the social consequences, depression involves a confrontation with questions of meaning, death, and value. Depression often brings questions like, what is the point of all this striving? Why do any of our efforts matter when we're all going to die? What is the meaning of my life? Are my goals genuinely meaningful or just culturally inherited pursuits that I've never examined? What does it mean to be a good person? What do I actually value versus what I think I should value? These are profound questions, and they're not inherently signs of pathology. They're questions humans have grappled with throughout history. Philosophy, literature, and spiritual traditions have long engaged with these existential concerns. From an evolutionary perspective, what's interesting is why these existential questions seem to emerge or intensify during depression. One possibility is that these questions emerge naturally when the normal motivational systems are dampened. When the reward systems are quiet, when motivation for normal goals is reduced, consciousness has space to step back and ask larger questions. The person can't just operate on automatic. They have to ask why they're doing what they're doing. Another possibility is that existential concerns emerge when the systems that normally provide meaning, social role, group membership, goal pursuit, are disrupted. When you lose your job, you're not just losing income, you're losing a major source of identity and meaning. The existential question, who am I if I'm not that, becomes pressing. Depression in this context reflects a genuine disruption of meaning-making structures. Depression as a signal about meaning and authenticity. From this perspective, depression might sometimes function as a signal that one's life is out of alignment with one's genuine values, or that one is living inauthentically. The existential psychiatrist Rollo May and others have suggested that depression can be a sign that the person is living in a way that betrays their authentic self. When someone is pursuing goals that they don't genuinely value, achieving status in domains they don't care about, or maintaining relationships that feel inauthentic, depression might function as a signal that something is wrong. The depression doesn't feel like malfunction, it feels like a genuine response to an unjust or inauthentic situation. This perspective aligns with some traditions in humanistic and existential psychology. From this view, depression isn't just a symptom to be eliminated, it's potentially a messenger with important information about how the person is living. The therapeutic task isn't just to make the person feel better, but to help them examine their life and potentially make changes to align their life with their genuine values and authentic self. This doesn't mean that depression is good or should be accepted, but it suggests that sometimes the solution to depression isn't just medication or symptom management, but genuine life change, changing jobs, leaving relationships, pursuing different goals, realigning with one's values. Depression and the integration of shadow aspects. Another existential perspective on depression comes from depth psychology and Jungian approaches. From this view, depression can involve the emergence of shadow aspects, the parts of ourselves that we've rejected, denied, or repressed because they conflict with our conscious self-image or social role. A person who has built an identity as competent and successful might experience depression when confronted with their own vulnerability, failure, or limitation. A person who has built an identity as independent might experience depression when confronted with their genuine need for others. A person who has built an identity as good and moral might experience depression when confronted with their own selfishness, anger, or destructive impulses. From this perspective, depression can be an opportunity for psychological integration, for acknowledging and accepting the parts of ourselves that we've denied. This integration, while painful, can lead to greater authenticity, wholeness, and psychological maturity. Again, this doesn't mean depression should be romanticized, or that depressed individuals should be told to simply accept and integrate their shadow. But it suggests that sometimes the most therapeutic path involves moving through the depression toward greater self-knowledge and acceptance rather than around it. Distinguishing depression from normal sadness and grief. One important question in understanding depression evolutionarily is how it relates to normal sadness and grief, emotional responses that appear universally and that appear to serve important functions. Grief is the psychological response to loss. When we lose someone or something significant, grief is the normal adaptive response. Grief typically involves sadness, yearning, social withdrawal, rumination about the lost person or object, and a gradual process of acceptance and reintegration. Grief is painful but functional. It serves to honor the lost relationship, to process what the loss means, and to gradually come to terms with the new reality. Sadness is a simpler emotion, a response to disappointment, loss, or failure. When things don't go as hoped, sadness is a normal response. Sadness, like grief, typically involves reduced motivation and social withdrawal, but it's usually less intense and more temporary than grief. How do these normal emotional responses relate to clinical depression? Similarities. Depression shares many features with grief and sadness: the reduced motivation, the social withdrawal, the inward focus, the rumination, the sense of emptiness. In fact, the specific trigger for depression is often loss or disappointment, so depression often emerges from contexts similar to those that trigger grief or sadness. Differences. There are several important differences between normal grief or sadness and clinical depression. First, grief and sadness typically involve a process. They intensify after the loss, then gradually diminish as the person comes to terms with the loss. Depression often persists without clear progression or resolution. Second, grief and sadness are typically focused. The person knows what they're sad about. Depression often involves a diffuse, objectless quality, or the sadness is disproportionate to the actual losses. Third, grief and sadness typically involve intact hope for the future, even in the context of the specific loss. Depression often involves a global hopelessness that extends beyond the specific loss to a sense that nothing will ever get better. The DSM criteria for major depressive disorder actually include an exception for grief. The criteria require symptoms lasting at least 2 weeks, but grief following bereavement isn't counted as depression until it's persisted for longer than expected. This recognition that grief is distinct from depression, even when they share similar features, is important. When grief becomes depression. However, the line between grief and depression can become blurred. Sometimes grief persists and intensifies into what becomes clinical depression. This is called complicated grief or persistent complex bereavement disorder. In these cases, the normal grief process seems to have become stuck, and the person shows depression symptoms that persist beyond the expected time frame. From an evolutionary perspective, what might be happening in complicated grief? Several possibilities. First, the loss might involve a fundamental identity disruption. If you lose a role or person that was central to your identity, a spouse after decades of marriage, a child, one's career after decades of work, the loss involves not just that specific person or role, but a reconstruction of self-identity. This process might take longer and involve more profound psychological reorganization than grief for other losses. Second, the loss might involve activation of depressive mechanisms for multiple reasons. The death of a spouse, for instance, involves loss of a relationship, potentially triggering social defeat or status loss mechanisms, loss of a major source of meaning, potentially loss of economic security, goal-blocking mechanisms, and physiological stress. Multiple depressive mechanisms might be activated simultaneously, creating a more profound and persistent depressive state. Third, the loss might interact with pre-existing vulnerabilities. Someone with genetic vulnerabilities to depression or with histories of trauma or previous depression might be more prone to having grief evolve into clinical depression. The functionality of grief and the dysfunction of prolonged depression. From an evolutionary perspective, grief appears to be a functional emotional mechanism designed to help us process loss and gradually reintegrate after loss. Prolonged, stuck grief that evolves into clinical depression, by contrast, appears to represent a malfunction of this system. The normal grief process has gotten stuck, and the depressive mechanisms are no longer serving their original function. This suggests that interventions for complicated grief should aim at getting the grief process unstuck, helping the person more fully acknowledge and process the loss, helping them gradually engage with life again, helping them develop new meaning and identity structures post-loss. This might involve therapy specifically designed for complicated grief, which helps the person systematically process the loss while gradually re-engaging with activities and social connections. Understanding suicidal thoughts in depression. One of the most serious aspects of depression is that it's associated with increased suicide risk. Approximately 90% of people who die by suicide meet criteria for a mental health disorder, with depression being the most common diagnosis. Understanding why depression is associated with suicide requires understanding both the neurobiology of depression and the psychology of suicidal thinking. In evolutionary terms, suicide is a puzzle. Self-harm and self-destruction don't seem adaptive. Yet suicidal thinking emerges reliably in depression, and suicide occurs across all cultures and throughout history. What evolutionary logic might explain the emergence of suicidal thoughts in depression? Several possibilities have been proposed. The pain and despair hypothesis. One view is that suicidal thinking emerges when psychological pain reaches an unbearable level and the person loses hope that things will get better. From this perspective, suicide represents the brain's misguided attempt to escape from unbearable psychological pain. The depressed person's thinking becomes constricted. They can't imagine that things might get better, can't see alternative solutions, and suicide appears as the only escape from the suffering. This hypothesis aligns with research showing that suicidal thinking is associated with hopelessness more strongly than with depression itself. People who are depressed but maintain hope are at lower risk. People who are depressed and hopeless are at much higher risk. The social pain hypothesis. Another view is that suicidal thinking arises particularly in contexts of social pain, social rejection, social defeat, loss of status. If depression functions in part to manage social hierarchies and social integration, then suicidal thinking might emerge when the depressed person perceives that social integration is impossible, that they will remain in a state of social defeat without possibility of recovery. This hypothesis is supported by research showing that suicide is particularly associated with social causes, relationship breakdown, social rejection, economic failure that carries public shame. Suicidal thinking often involves a narrative of social failure and hopelessness about social redemption. The evolutionary byproduct hypothesis. A third view is that suicidal thinking, while clearly problematic now, might be a byproduct of mechanisms that were evolutionarily adaptive. For instance, mechanisms that reduce pain and heighten risk-taking in the face of danger might sometimes result in reduced aversion to one's own death. Mechanisms that reduce motivation and goal pursuit might sometimes extend to a reduction in motivation to preserve one's own life. From this perspective, suicidal thinking would be an unintended byproduct of systems that were selected for other functions, and that byproduct becomes particularly problematic in modern contexts where means of self-harm are readily available, and where psychological pain can become chronic and seemingly inescapable. The importance of prevention and crisis intervention. Regardless of the evolutionary explanation for suicidal thinking, the critically point is clear. Suicidal thinking in depression is a serious sign requiring immediate intervention. When someone is experiencing depression accompanied by suicidal thoughts, they need professional help. This might include immediate safety, ensuring the person has access to support, that means of self-harm are reduced, and that they have resources to call if they're in crisis. Psychiatric evaluation, assessment by a psychiatrist or other mental health professional to evaluate suicide risk and determine what level of care is needed. Medication. In many cases, antidepressant medication can reduce suicidal thinking, particularly when the suicidal thinking is part of a depressive episode that responds to medication. Psychotherapy. Various forms of psychotherapy have been shown to reduce suicidal thinking. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps people develop coping strategies and address hopelessness. Dialectical behavior therapy, developed specifically for people with chronic suicidal thinking, helps people develop distress tolerance and emotion regulation skills. Interpersonal therapy helps address social and relationship problems that might be driving suicidal thoughts. Social support. Connection with family, friends, and community is crucial. People who have strong social connections are at lower risk for suicide even when depressed. Building and maintaining these connections is an important part of prevention. Understanding resilience. While depression is common, most people don't become depressed even when facing significant adversities. Understanding resilience, the ability to adapt well despite stress or adversity, provides important insights into why some people develop depression and others don't. Resilience isn't the absence of depression or distress. Rather, it's the ability to experience distress while maintaining function and gradually recovering. A resilient person might experience sadness, anxiety, or depressive symptoms in response to adversity, but they continue to function and gradually adapt. Research on resilience has identified several factors that promote resilience. Social connection and support. People with strong family, friend, and community connections show better outcomes after adversity. The support provides practical help, emotional validation, and a sense of belonging and mattering, all of which buffer against depression. Sense of meaning and purpose. People who have a sense of meaning in their lives, whether through spiritual belief, values-based goals, community contribution, or creative work, show better resilience. When facing adversity, the person's sense of meaning helps them interpret the adversity as meaningful struggle rather than as pure meaningless suffering. Coping skills and emotional regulation. People who have developed skills to cope with stress, problem-solving skills, emotion regulation abilities, the ability to distinguish between solvable and unsolvable problems, show better resilience. These skills help people respond actively to addressable problems rather than becoming passive. Physical health practices. People who exercise regularly, sleep well, maintain nutrition, and avoid substance abuse show better mental health outcomes and better resilience. Physical health and mental health are deeply connected. Practices that support physical health also support psychological resilience. Cognitive flexibility. People who can reframe situations, who can hold multiple perspectives, and who can adjust their thinking in light of evidence show better resilience. Those who become locked in rigid negative thinking are more vulnerable to depression. Self-efficacy and sense of agency. People who believe they can affect outcomes, who have experience of successfully handling challenges, and who maintain a sense of personal agency show better resilience. This sense of efficacy might be developed through overcoming progressively more challenging problems. Building resilience through experience. One important finding from resilience research is that resilience isn't fixed. People can develop greater resilience through experience. In particular, the experience of facing and managing challenges appears to build resilience. People who have successfully navigated adversity, who have faced a problem, found ways to cope, and gradually adapted, show greater resilience for subsequent challenges. This suggests that some challenge and adversity, while painful, might actually be psychologically beneficial. The person who faces and overcomes difficulties develops competence and confidence that transfers to future challenges. The person who is completely protected from challenges might remain more psychologically fragile. This doesn't mean that adversity should be sought out or that severe trauma is beneficial, but it suggests that a certain amount of manageable challenge within a context of support actually promotes psychological development and resilience. The role of post-traumatic growth. Related to resilience is the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth. The finding that after facing severe adversity or trauma, many people report positive psychological changes. These might include increased appreciation for life, improved relationships, personal strength, spiritual growth, or changed life priorities. This doesn't mean the trauma was good or that everyone experiences growth after trauma, but it suggests that difficult experiences can catalyze psychological development and that meaning can emerge from suffering. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Our ancestors regularly faced significant adversities: loss, injury, social conflict, resource scarcity. Those who could extract meaning and learning from these experiences, who could use adversity as a catalyst for growth and adaptation, would have better outcomes than those who became permanently broken by adversity. The capacity for post-traumatic growth appears to be a deep human capacity, but it requires both the experience of adversity and the psychological conditions that support growth. These conditions include social support, time for processing, opportunities to make meaning of the experience, and possibly connection to something larger than oneself. A comprehensive model of depression. Based on everything we've discussed, let me propose an integrative framework for understanding depression that acknowledges both its evolutionary origins and its modern complexity. Depression as a complex system. Rather than a single disorder with a single cause, depression is best understood as a complex system involving multiple mechanisms and multiple pathways. The system includes mechanisms for managing social status, for disengaging from impossible goals, for focused analytical thinking, for energy conservation, for signaling need and distress, and for confronting existential meaning. Context dependency. Whether this system functions adaptively or maladaptively depends heavily on context. When the system is triggered by genuine problems, social defeat, goal blockade, illness, chronic stress, that can be addressed through depressive withdrawal and disengagement, the system might function reasonably. When the system is triggered by factors that can't be addressed through withdrawal, chronic social inequality, ongoing threats, impossible cultural goals, or when the system remains activated long after the triggering event, depression becomes maladaptive. Multi-level causation. Depression involves causation at multiple levels: evolutionary, why these mechanisms exist; genetic, individual differences in system sensitivity; developmental, early experiences that shape system calibration; social, current social circumstances and support; cognitive, thinking patterns that amplify or ameliorate depression; and circumstantial, specific events or stressors. Treatment based on this comprehensive model should ideally address multiple levels. At the circumstantial level, addressing actual problems, helping the person recover employment, repair relationships, resolve conflicts, address safety concerns, or, when problems can't be fixed, helping the person grieve and adapt. At the cognitive level, helping the person identify and modify thinking patterns that amplify depression, reducing rumination when unhelpful, increasing behavioral activation, developing more flexible thinking. At the behavioral level, helping the person engage in activities that support well-being, exercise, social connection, purposeful activity, sleep regulation, stress reduction practices. At the social level, building and maintaining social connections, addressing isolation, building community, restoring sense of belonging and meaning. At the developmental level, addressing early trauma or insecure attachment patterns that might predispose to depression, building secure relationships that repair early relational wounds. At the biological level, when appropriate, using medication to modulate the systems involved in depression, allowing the person sufficient motivation and mood stability to engage in other interventions. At the existential level, supporting the person in examining their life, values, and meaning, helping them determine whether they're living authentically and meaningfully, and supporting life changes if needed. This comprehensive approach recognizes that different interventions will be appropriate for different people and different contexts, and that treatment ideally involves multiple approaches working synergistically. The role of prevention. Understanding depression evolutionarily also illuminates prevention. Rather than waiting until depression is severe and requires treatment, we might prevent depression by addressing the conditions that trigger depressive mechanisms. Social connection and community. Building and maintaining strong social connections, developing stable communities, ensuring people have places where they belong and matter, all of this appears to be fundamentally protective against depression. Meaning and purpose. Helping people develop meaningful goals, connect to something larger than themselves, develop spiritual or philosophical frameworks that provide meaning, all of this appears protective. Challenge and mastery. Providing people with challenges that stretch them but are within their capacity to manage, allowing them to develop mastery and confidence. Physical health. Supporting exercise, sleep, nutrition, and stress management practices that maintain physical and mental health. Reducing chronic stress. Addressing sources of chronic stress where possible, reducing inequality, supporting economic security, reducing violence and victimization, creating workplaces and educational systems that support well-being. Early intervention. When depression first emerges, early intervention can prevent escalation into chronic depression. This might involve psychotherapy, social support, addressing specific stressors, or medication if symptoms are severe. Remaining puzzles. Despite significant progress in understanding depression evolutionarily, several important puzzles remain. The universality paradox. Depression is universal across cultures, yet the rates of depression appear to have increased substantially in recent decades in developed nations. If depression is evolutionarily adaptive, why would it become more common rather than less common in modern contexts? Some possibilities: modern conditions have created more of the triggers that activate depressive mechanisms. Modern conditions have reduced our ability to resolve the problems that trigger depression. Or, improved diagnosis and reduced stigma have increased reporting of depression that was always present but previously hidden. The persistence paradox. Depression often persists even after the circumstances that triggered it have improved. If depression functions to handle specific problems, why doesn't it resolve once those problems are resolved? Some possibilities: the depressive systems have become dysregulated and require specific intervention to reset. The person has learned depressive thinking patterns that persist even after circumstances improve. Or there's a component of depression, perhaps inflammatory or related to chronic stress, that has become independent of the original trigger. The treatment response paradox. Many people respond well to treatment for depression, but many don't. Some people show complete remission of symptoms, others show partial response, others show no response despite trying multiple treatments. What accounts for these differences? Why does the same intervention work for some people and not others? The mechanism specificity question. It remains unclear which specific depressive mechanisms are responsible for which depressive symptoms and how they interact. Does rumination cause the social withdrawal, or does social withdrawal cause the rumination? How do the different mechanisms influence each other? Future research directions. Several important research directions could advance our understanding. Longitudinal studies tracking the natural course of depression. Understanding how depression typically develops, progresses, and resolves, or fails to resolve, could illuminate the mechanisms at work. Studies examining individual differences in mechanisms. Not all depressed people show the same mechanisms. Some have primarily motivational symptoms, others primarily have rumination, others primarily have physical symptoms. Understanding what determines which mechanisms are activated in whom could improve treatment matching. Research on resilience and prevention. Understanding the specific factors that promote resilience and prevent depression and how these factors might be fostered could lead to more effective prevention. Cross-cultural research. Examining how depression manifests and is understood across diverse cultures could illuminate both universal and culturally specific aspects of depression. Mechanistic research. Using neuroimaging, computational modeling, and other methods to understand the specific brain systems and mechanisms involved in depression and how they interact. Intervention research. Testing the effectiveness of different treatments for different types of depression and understanding what factors predict treatment response. What we've learned. Let me bring together the main threads of what we've explored over these hours together. Depression is not a simple malfunction, nor is it simply an adaptive response to modern problems. Rather, depression involves multiple systems that evolved to handle specific adaptive problems in ancestral environments. These systems, status management, goal disengagement, analytical thinking, energy conservation, social communication, served important functions ancestrally. In modern contexts, these systems are sometimes triggered inappropriately, sometimes persist after resolution, and sometimes become dysregulated. Additionally, modern life has created novel challenges: chronic stress, social disconnection, impossible goals, information overload that these ancestral systems weren't designed to handle. The result is that depression, while it might be partially understandable as an evolved response, is now far too common and far too destructive to be accepted or embraced. Understanding depression evolutionarily doesn't lead to either extreme, neither to the view that depression is just a disease to be eradicated with medication, nor to the romantic view that depression is a gift or that we should accept it as part of the human condition. Rather, a balanced understanding recognizes that depression involves real biological and psychological mechanisms that we need to address, but that addressing depression effectively often requires addressing the actual life circumstances and meaning structures that triggered the depression in the first place. Implications for how we live. If depression is partly a signal about problems in how we're living, social disconnection, loss of meaning, pursuit of impossible goals, chronic stress, then the most fundamental prevention of depression involves examining how we're living and making changes to align our lives with genuine human needs and values. This might involve building and maintaining strong social connections, engaging in meaningful work or activity, developing spiritual or philosophical frameworks that provide meaning, ensuring adequate rest and recovery, physical exercise and health practices, engaging with nature, engaging in creative or generative activities, building communities, caring for others, and regularly examining our lives and values to ensure we're living authentically. These practices aren't cures for depression when it's already present, but they appear to be fundamentally protective, creating conditions under which depression is less likely to emerge and more likely to resolve if it does. Implications for how we treat depression. An evolutionary understanding also has implications for treatment. It suggests that treatment should be multifaceted, addressing the actual problems that triggered depression, supporting behavioral and cognitive changes, rebuilding social connection and meaning, and, when appropriate, using medication to restore sufficient functioning to engage in these other interventions. It suggests that one-dimensional approaches, treating depression only with medication or only with therapy or only by changing thinking, are less likely to be effective than approaches that address multiple levels. It suggests that the therapeutic relationship matters, that being understood, validated, and cared for by another person is fundamentally important in treating depression. It suggests that time matters, that depression often requires time to resolve, that there are limits to how quickly psychological change can occur, and that patience and self-compassion are important. A final reflection. Standing back from all of this detail, what emerges is a picture of depression as a profoundly human condition, arising from the intersection of our evolved psychology and our modern circumstances, involving both genuine suffering and the possibility of genuine growth, sometimes a malfunction and sometimes a signal about how we're living. The person experiencing depression is not broken or defective. They're experiencing an intensification or dysregulation of normal psychological systems. They're often confronting real problems: social isolation, meaningless activity, impossible goals, chronic stress. And they're often being offered an opportunity, if they can move through the depression with support, to reconsider how they're living and to make changes toward greater authenticity, connection, and meaning. This doesn't minimize depression's suffering or make it acceptable, but it situates depression within the normal range of human psychology, subject to the same pressures and possibilities as other aspects of our minds and our lives. The goal is neither to eliminate depression entirely, which might not be possible or desirable, as it might involve the sensitivity and depth that sometimes accompanies depression, nor to accept depression as inevitable. Rather, the goal is to understand depression deeply, to address it comprehensively, and to use our understanding to help people navigate depression when it arises, to prevent it when possible, and to extract meaning and growth from it when it occurs. Thank you for joining me on this journey through depression. I hope this exploration has provided a framework for understanding not just the condition of depression itself, but also something about human nature, evolution, and what it means to be psychologically and neurologically complex creatures trying to live meaningful lives in modern circumstances that our ancestors never imagined.